Welcome everybody for another instalment of our drop-in sessions. Today's session we're looking at the Quantify module. So again, very similar to last week in that this is a topic that we've covered before. Of course, this is a bit more of a features and functionality topic. And the interesting part about this one in particular is that we're obviously now doing it in the latest release of Skore. So I think for some of you on the call will have seen that, or perhaps even used the Quantify module in the past, certainly in the legacy version of Skore. So this would be a good chance to sort of see how it differs or changes slightly in the new release. And of course, for those of you who are completely new or haven't used Quantify to date, then a bit of an overview of the functionality, how it works, and so on. I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail on it, but what I'll try and do is a whistle-stop tour of what it is, why we use it, and then take you through, walk through an example and touch on the key areas of the module. So what is Quantify? Well, it is, as I said, it's a set of features and functionality that allows us to very quickly capture durations and costs against activities and roles within a process, so that we can calculate how long does the process take and how much does it costs. And indeed, we can even go as far as to start to try and understand who do we need to be able to run the process. Okay, so let me share my screen and then just talk a little bit about why you would want to use Quantify. So let's bring up some notes here. Thumbs up, Sam, if you can see that. Yeah, perfect, brilliant, thank you. So of course, there's lots and lots of different reasons or benefits that using Quantify can bring. So I've just brought together some of the most common ones that we see. I think one of the fascinating things is I've put at the top of the list here this idea of identifying hidden costs and bottlenecks. Actually, most people who pick up and use Quantify have a specific use case for it. It's slightly different. But that exercise of walking through the process, so having already mapped the process and then sitting with the team and starting to talk about, okay, well, how long does this particular step in the process take? What are any of the costs associated with it? Are there things that we have to wait for before we can execute this activity? Just the act of having that conversation and filling that information in against individual activities starts to open up some really interesting conversations. People will often sit there and someone will say, oh, well, that typically takes me 5 minutes. And then Claudia will say, well, it does take you 5 minutes, but actually we always have to wait an hour because somebody else has to do something else first. And you think, oh, yeah, of course. And then that's going to add extra time. So it starts to expose those kind of tensions that can exist in a process that until the time you sort of step back and talk about it, will often go hidden or missed. And similarly with it can be either cost or bottlenecks. And by a bottleneck, I mean somewhere where the process is being squeezed or slowed down in some way. And so first of all, you've got this exercise of just working through individual activities or steps in a process and talking about the challenges that you might face against them, around them, entering that information in the system, and then Skore will start to show you insights into that. It will start to show you things like where lots of delay lies, which role does a delay sit with, or what role does the cost sit with in the given process. So again, it's a different way of looking at of that information. Understanding the impact of changes. I think this is a really good one that again is often underutilized, I believe, quite strongly when looking at processes, because it's very easy when we look at a process to say, hey, wouldn't it be great if we just changed that, or we removed that step, or we A classic one is you often hear is when someone will say, oh, well, we could mitigate that quality issue by adding an extra check earlier in the process. And it's very easy to draw an extra box on a flowchart, but it might be quite expensive to do that in practice. And so again, with the Quantify, you can very quickly go, well, what's the impact on my process by adding that extra step in? Because the cost of adding that extra step might outweigh the cost of the risk that you were trying to mitigate in the first place. So it makes it very, very easy to quickly do that sort of assessment and go, actually, is it worth even doing this? Is it going to have a significant impact on my process? The third item I've got in here, which is probably the most common use we see for using Quantify in Skore, is around creating a business case. So I've called it creating a business case for change. We most often see it in areas where people are looking to automate or invest in technology to improve a process. And a classic example of this was very early in my career, where we looked at a process we had identified as a very, very manual process, and it could be automated to speed things up. And we went and looked at technology to do this, and the cost of the technology was around £50,000. This was probably about nearly 20 years ago, and the cost of the technology was about £50,000. And trying to get the budget was incredible. No one wanted to sign off that amount of money at the time. When we did this exercise of trying to calculate what the cost of the current manual process, it was £250,000 a year. That we could actually remove from the process. And so when we were able to then present it in that way, it obviously made a lot of sense. But sometimes gathering that information, putting it together in a way that makes that you can communicate easily with other people is quite difficult. And again, with doing this against the process, you can clearly lay out the process, everyone can understand it, you can then show the calculations and how you've arrived at that. So it can be very powerful. So a few other ones on here. I won't go into so much depth in these, but things like calculating your cost of service. Again, we've seen this in a number of cases, say around accountancy, where they're offering a sort of repetitive service around things like payroll outsourcing, for example. It's really important to be able to understand the cost of those services. In accountancy, it's interesting because they are often selling high value services on top of that. And in many cases, we've seen that companies can be making a loss on the base services because they don't really have a good understanding of what the cost of that service is. And a client will be happy to pay for it if they understand why it costs what it costs. And so having a good handle of what your cost of service, again, makes it much easier to have a conversation with the client and make sure that there's sufficient margin for it to make sense to run that service. Understanding capacity. So I touched on this a little bit before, but if we want to increase the number of times we do something, and I'll touch on this a second in my example, do we have enough people in the team? Or actually, we've got X number of people in the team, how many times could we run this process over a given period? So again, Quantify will allow you to start to make those sorts of calculations. And then you're closely related to that is to be able to explore different future state scenarios. A lot of the development of Quantify was actually driven during the early stages of the pandemic, when a number of organizations we work with were really looking at, okay, this is completely changing demand for our product. Sometimes demand dropped off a cliff, sometimes demand was going through the roof, and in other cases demand for one product was dropping off while another one was growing. And so trying to be able to go to understand, okay, what's the impact in the next 2 to 3 months? We think that the the environment's going to change completely again in 6 months. So what would it look like in that sort of time period? You can start to do those sorts of calculations. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just take you through a very brief example process. You see I've got a recruitment process here. This is done from the perspective of a recruitment agency, so somebody hiring staff for another organization. So I'll quickly talk you through the process, show you how the information is captured, and then talk through some of the dashboards that the Quantify module produces from those different perspectives. So very quickly, as I said, this is an agency, so they would typically have a customer come in looking to fill a position within their organization. So there's a new request for a new hire comes in. Account manager is going to review that with the client and create a recruitment plan. A recruitment assistant is going to then review the organization's existing database and contact list to see if they've got anyone suitable. They will push out adverts onto a number of different platforms to invite applications for the role. They will wait a certain amount of time, a number of days, before they would then start processing those applications. From that, they'd create a shortlist. An account manager is then going to conduct the initial interviews with that shortlist of candidates, while the recruitment assistant schedules and manages that interview calendar. And then they would then have a shortlist, if you like. They hand over to the client and they manage those interviews for the benefit of the client to arrive at a new hire selected. I've deliberately kept this very simple, just to talk to be able to explain the principles of the Quantify module, but hopefully it makes sense just in terms of very, very high level process. So adding the information around Quantify, I talked about before. First thing we want to do is start thinking about how long does an individual activity take. So if I take the first activity here, and I'm going to click on the attachment icon to open the left panel, and then you'll see there's a Quantify section in there. I'm currently in view mode, so I'm only seeing the sections that have information in them, but in edit mode, you'll obviously see all sections that are available. The first time you add Quantify information, there's a little button there which says add Quantify information. So you need to click that first, and then it will create this form that you'll see. And in the form here, I can start to enter how long does this activity take. For some activities, that information is going to be easier to find than others. Sometimes you have to have a bit of a discussion and make a bit of a judgment. On average, how long does it typically take us to execute this activity? Sometimes you may have data available from existing systems to be able to look at that. Other times it's just a bit more having a conversation with people that do it to work it out. So we put a duration in there. We can also enter a volume. So when we think about this, when we're putting this information about at first, it's really useful to think about this in terms of a single iteration through your process. So we're talking about new hires. So we're going to think about it from the prospect of a single new hire going through this whole process. So obviously in this case, for this activity, the account manager is only going to put that recruitment plan together once per new hire. So the volume is 1. But if we move forward and look at something, for example, like processing inquiries, then here we can start to think about, well, typically how many applications might we get for a position? And here we've used a number of 21. So typically for every application in this business, we get 21. Sorry, for any new position, we get 21 applications in there, so we can enter that information. We can also add a wait time. So wait time is really useful for putting in any time against the process where nothing is actually being done, but you're having to wait, or there's some sort of delay. One of the most common reasons for delays that I see in processes is around approvals. Often you're waiting, you raise a requisition or purchase order, or and then you have to wait for somebody to sign that off, and that can often create very significant delays in a process. Here, just out of interest, one of the things we've done here in this example, and this is loosely based on a real customer example, is that there was a typical delay. So they would advertise the position and then they'd wait, I think it was 3 to 4 days before they would start looking at the applications. So applications might start coming in straight away, but they would wait a number of days before they'd actually pick them up and try to do them all at the same time. So in that case, what we did is we said, well, we know that the volume is around 21. So we took 4 days and we divided it by 21 to give us a waiting time of 1 hour, 30 minutes per applications. We put the information in that so that it calculates an accurate delay for the process. And then the final piece of information that we can attach against an activity is the direct cost. So this is the material cost of executing that activity. And a great example is over here on the advertised position. So when we advertise out onto multiple platforms, that costs around £2,000 per position that they're advertising. So it's not the cost of the role, but the cost of things that we might need to do this activity. Now, that's the information we need to do at an activity by activity level. The other information that you would need to capture if you are looking at costs is the individual costs of the roles. So let me quickly show you where that is. If we go to the business tools, I'm going to click on roles here. Now remember, I am in the recruitment process. So when I run the business tools directly from the from within that process, then the information it's going to show me is specifically to that process. So it's not showing me the other processes in the workspace. So here, when I come to roles, I'm only going to see the 2 roles that are available in this process. And if I click on one of those, I'll take the account manager first. You will see the information that I'm talking about will be displayed at the top. So the hourly rate for this role, and then FTE, which stands for full-time equivalent. So this is essentially how many account managers have I got. In this case, I've got 2. Now, if you've not yet entered this information into your roles in Skore, you won't see that section. To add that section, click Edit Role, and you will, when you go into the Edit panel, it gives you the ability to then add your full-time equivalents and hourly costs in there. Okay, so now once you've done that across your roles, the system will then be able to calculate duration of the process as well as the cost of the process, and with the full-time equivalent information, it will be able to look at that capacity as well. So if I go up to the top, I don't need to go back to the process view. I can switch between the business tools from the top here, and this time I'm going to go to the Quantify section. Now, the first thing that Quantify shows you, again, remember I'm in the process, so it's only showing me the quantification information for this one process. If I were to go back to the workspace and click on Quantify from there, it would show me everything, and then you would have to use the scope to filter out what you want to include. So first thing it shows you when you open this up is the overview screen. So just very, very high level overviews of some of the numbers like total cost, total processing time, etc. But just above this, we have a Quantify Selector. And this is essentially for the simulation. So it allows us to start to explore different scenarios. Again, very strong recommendation when you start using this, when you start working on a process to quantify it, start with one, because you want to think about in terms of one iteration. And then once you've got everything ready, you can then build out or experiment with different scenarios from there. So it's always really good to start there. So you have the Quantify Selector set to 1, and then you can choose the sort of scope and duration that you're looking at. I mean, I always start with a week and then work from there, but you'll see how it works in a second. So first thing I want to go and look at is the duration. So if I open up click on the duration section, so this starts to tell me more information about how long it takes. Now, there are some configuration options. I won't have time to go into them, but from the config section up there, there's some configuration around how you display the information. So I've taken this from the perspective of a sort of human readable format, and looking at it from the hours that we spend working. So when it says 2 weeks and 2 hours, it basically means 2 sets of 5 days, so 10 days of actual working, where each day is 7.5 hours worth of work. You can adjust those settings to display this in different ways, but it gives you the sense that actually typically in this recruitment process, from the moment that the account manager sits down with the customer and starts working out that recruitment plan, they can expect 2 weeks and 2 hours before they get that position placed. That's the lead time. Now, if you look over here on the next section, we talk about the processing time, and that's 1 week and 1 hour. So the difference between those two is that the lead time includes all of the delay in that process. So that's the total time it takes, whereas the processing time is the time that the team are actually spent working on it. So that's the almost, you could say, the billable time, if you like. Now, if I scroll down in each of these sections, you'll see there's a lot more detailed information and analysis about this. And again, depending on the process or what you're looking for, different graphs will be useful to you. But straight away, I mean, the combined graph here shows you by activity. So obviously the grey piece is showing you the waiting time in the process or in that activity, and then the green is showing you the actual processing time. So you can start to see the balance. Again, when you've got lots of delay in a process, really interesting to see which activities carries that delay. Or you can look at it specifically by processing time or by wait time. Again, these become quite useful. Sometimes you'll get a delay time which is so large that the way it pushes all the processing time down, so you can barely see it on the graph. So these then become quite useful for that. If I scroll further down, it then also does a breakdown by roles as well. And this is one I was talking about before, often where you've got approvals, bottlenecks caused by approvals. You might see up here, actually, you've got lots of activities with small amounts of delay. And then when you come and look at it, but from the role perspective, you'll often see one role that has this huge amount of delay in it. And then you can start to say, okay, well, why is that happening? And it might be that particular role, which perhaps isn't heavily involved in this particular process, but is overworked somewhere else and is causing a delay in your process here. So you can see where individual roles carry delays, or again, you can start to see where specific roles are spending a lot of time in a process. We had a really interesting one recently with a client where a very high fee earning role was doing lots of admin work within a process, and it became really clear in here that was happening. And when I talked before about this is really powerful for understanding the impact of changes, you can of course go back to the process, make a change on the process, and then come in here and see what the impact of that was. So what they did in that case is they went back to the process and said, actually, it doesn't make sense for this role to be doing these activities. Let's put this role on instead. And when they came back in here, they could see a huge impact on that. In that case, it was cost more than anything, but it was a big impact. So let me quickly touch on the cost one. It's very similar, but obviously does it from a cost perspective. The difference here is that it starts to tell us our total cost of the process, and then it gives us a breakdown between what the roles are costing us and then the fixed costs. So if you remember, the advertising costs. And I talked about that cost of service piece. So again, this is quite interesting. When you start to look at this from a single iteration, you go, oh, that's quite interesting. It sort of makes sense. But as you start to go, well, what does that look like? Okay, let's say we're typically doing we're placing 4 people, or we're initiating 4 placements a week. What does that look like over the year? And you can start to look at what the cost of that is over a given year, and then you can start to say, okay, well, that's what we're spending per year. Oh goodness, look, we're nearly spending $500,000 just on advertising. So you can start to think about, okay, do we want to go back and renegotiate our advertising contract, or those sorts of things. So sometimes it highlights things that might look like small changes on a single iteration. When you start to look at, okay, well, we're doing this 10 times a day and we do it every single day throughout the year, those numbers go, okay, it's now worth doing something about that or trying to fix that particular issue. And you can see how you can do that very, very quickly, explore these different scenarios very, very quickly. And then, so what I'm going to do now, just show you very quickly, touch on the last section here, which is the Fte simulation. So this is assuming that you've put those full-time equivalents in against the roles, you can start to really understand what that capacity looks like in a particular process. And this chart here, what this starts to show you here, you'll see that I've left my Quantify Selector on 4, so I'm 4 iterations of the process. This chart starts to tell us how much surplus or deficit we have in the existing roles that we've got. And you can see that at 4 hires per week, we've got a little bit of surplus in there. With the account manager, that's probably quite a nice level to have. The recruitment assistant, you might think that's a little bit high, but if you hover over it, you can see quite clearly we've got 3 available. We need 2.57, which means we've got a surplus of 4. And you can start to say, well, what happens if we're going to be growing this business, so we're going to move up to 7. What does that look like? And it will start to show you, hey, look, you probably need to, you really need to be hiring at least 1 more account manager and probably 2 more recruitment assistants. Equally, you could go back and look at the process and go, what sort of tweaks and things can we make in the process to help manage the capacity. The example that I was using, that I used to show the process before, when we looked at this with a client during the pandemic, they, in one of their business lines, that number of applications that they were getting for each position shot up. Okay, it went up to from around 20 to 100 within a couple of weeks, because other areas of the economy had completely dropped. And so when they looked at their standard process and they tried to do it, they even if they doubled the team, they wouldn't have had enough people to be able to manage the extra capacity. But it allowed them to have a really good conversation around, okay, well, what are we prepared to change in the process to be able to bring that down, the time it's taking us for each hire. And so in their case, they looked at changing the criteria so that they could run the process the applications much faster and add in a bit of technology and so on. So all of this is about providing intelligence to help you make different or decisions around the process. So realize we're really close to time, so at that point I'm going to stop at that point and see if there's any thoughts or questions on anything I've shown you so far.